And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Sunday, August 18th, 2024. We start out with the sea ice. The ice continues to melt off here along the Beaufort Sea coastline, especially there just offshore of Prudhoe Bay. We still have a fair amount of ice along the Russian Arctic coast. That so far is held in place. It is slowly melting, but there are signs we're going to get some colder air coming in out of eastern Russia and the Arctic Ocean that could perhaps push some of that toward the Bering Strait here in the next week or so as we head toward the end of the month. We'll have to keep an eye on that because it is going to remain an active weather pattern, a more fall-like pattern taking shape here to close out the month of August. We're having weather systems just one after another every other day or two. This is storm number 2 that is lifted northeastward across the west side of the state, pushing a front through the Gulf. And then here comes the next weather system. That will impact the west coast, especially Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound, Bering Strait as we get into Wednesday this coming week. So late tonight into Monday morning, we have the one system that just continues lifting northeastward and just a weak remnant low along the Gulf Coast that's not really much. The front presses east. Overall, the mainland has cooled down. Panhandle getting in on a few showers, especially northern areas and perhaps down along this weakening front. But this was a former typhoon that impacted Japan, Typhoon Ampel. And this storm is going to be taking aim toward the Bering Strait, a track in a northeasterly direction, which could impact Norton Sound. At this point, it's not going to be nearly as strong as Merbach was a couple of years ago, but we'll keep a very close eye on it, as it will have gale force winds with some storm force gusts that will cause some coastal flooding potential and certainly high surf in this area for the middle of the upcoming week. Meanwhile, as we get into Tuesday, a ridge of high pressure should provide areas of south central and the central eastern mainland with some pretty nice weather between systems. But then by, again, Tuesday afternoon, that low is still quite a ways west of St. Lawrence Island. It'll continue tracking northeastward toward the Bering Strait, and as it does so, this front will push through and produce some stronger gale force winds that will impact Norton Sound and along areas of the Seward coastline there through the Bering Strait and even up into Kotzebue Sound. Looking at the marine forecast then on Monday for the inner channels of the Panhandle. South winds 20 knots, the exception being there, Petersburg, Stevens Passage, look for southeast winds to 10 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet. And then for the outer coast, generally west winds 10-15 knots, especially between Yakutat and just south of Sitka, those south winds to 10 knots there, off of Craig with 5-foot waves, and southwesterly winds to 10 knots with 7-8-foot swells there around Cape Suckling. For Tuesday, we're looking at southeast to south winds 10 knots within the inner channels, waves running just a foot or two. For the outer coast, west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots outside of Gustavus down off of Sitka and Craig. Kind of a mixed bag of winds off of Yakutat Bay and toward Cape Suckling at 10 knots, swells 6 to 7 feet. On Monday, across the northwestern Gulf, strongest winds will be 30-knot westerly winds here, lower Cook Inlet, and just to the north of Kodiak Island. Swells there 8 to 10 feet. Prince William Sound, northwest winds 15 knots with waves of 3 feet. And then in upper Cook Inlet, look for southwest winds to 20 knots with waves 4 or 5 feet. And on Tuesday, winds will come down a bit. Northwest winds 15 knots within Prince William Sound, 3-foot waves. Outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, swells 4 to 5 feet. Northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, upper middle Cook Inlet, but then northwesterly out of the lower portion of Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, and to the north there of Kodiak Island, northwest winds 25 knots and swells 5 to 6 feet. For Monday, across Kodiak Island, 25 to 30 knot westerly winds, waves 7 to 8 feet there, even within Shelikof Strait. Otherwise, west winds 20-25 knots within Bristol Bay with 8-foot swells. Winds kind of become a little more variable, try to switch back southwesterly, falls past Cold Bay. And then on Tuesday, things are a little lighter winds up, at least here around Kodiak Island, southwest winds to 15 knots. Waves running right around 3-4 feet. Those winds, as you go down the Alaska Peninsula, will become south-southeasterly, 15 knots on the North Pacific side, and picking up 15 to as high as 25 knots there north of Cold Bay. Waves 3 to 4 feet on the Bering side. Variable winds in the vicinity of Kodiak, the eastern Aleutians from Unalaska down through Nikolsky, 20 to 25 knot winds, but they're going to quickly flip around to the southeast. And once you get west of Adak on Monday, look for 45 knot gales to 50 knot storm force winds out toward Shemya from the southeast, and swells building above 20 feet there, Kiska out toward Shemya, because that low center will be passing close to Shemya as it tracks northeastward up into the central and western Bering. In the wake of the system, winds turn south or southwest. We're looking at south-southwest winds 25 knots across the eastern and central Aleutians. Once you're west of Adak, 35 knot southwesterly gales, and still waves generally in excess of 15 feet there across the western Aleutians. For the southwest coast, westerly winds of 25 knots into Kuskokwim Bay, Bristol Bay, swells 6-7 feet. Southwest winds 15 knots, St. Matthew through St. Paul, swells 8 to 9 feet. And then westerly winds as high as 25 to 30 knots there into the upper part of the Yukon coastline into Norton Sound with waves of 6 to 7 feet. And for Tuesday, with that approaching system that's still way out in the central and northwest Bering, winds are going to be east-southeast here, Kuskokwim Bay and into Bristol Bay. Strongest, though, 35 knots there, Kuskokwim Bay up through Etolan Strait and just off of Hooper Bay. We have 40-knot south winds with swells of 15 to 20 feet there around St. Matthew. And look for southeast to south winds 25 to 30 knots off the lower Yukon Delta into that wider expanse of Norton Sound with waves of 5 to 6 feet. And as we get into Wednesday, the gale force winds and much higher surf and higher waves are going to impact this entire area. So stay tuned to future advisories and warnings for that system for Wednesday into Thursday. Now, out here south of the Bering Strait, look for northwest to west winds as high as 25 knots along the west coastline here of the Seward Peninsula from Wales down to Nome. Lower Chukchi Sea, 30 to 35 knot northwesterly winds with swells of 7 to 10 feet. And then up here north of Point Lay to Utqiagvik, north winds 15 to 20 knots, but still ahead of the front that's slowly working east, southwest winds to 20 knots, Prudhoe Bay up to Kaktovik. And then on Tuesday, we'll see westerly winds of 30 knots, Kaktovik with 7-foot waves. South-southwest winds 15 knots, Prudhoe Bay back to Utqiagvik. Those winds then go southwest and switch southerly to around 30 knots across the lower Chukchi Sea, swells of 5 to 7 feet. And then areas along the west side of the Seward Peninsula and the north side of St. Lawrence Island look for south to southeast winds to 30 knots on Tuesday with waves of 5 to 6 feet. And as I mentioned, this region here into Norton Sound will see much stormier conditions Wednesday into Thursday, so stay tuned to the potential for future advisories or warnings.